So I hope you all enjoyed your lunch, and now it is time for our final session, and we'll be hearing from Avi Faust and Ann Schaefer. And first, I'd like to welcome up Avi Faust of Bar Ilan University, who will be speaking on the Egyptian Empire in Canaan and the transformation of Highland identities.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I would like first to thank the organizer for inviting me and for the hospitality and everything. It's very kind. I will start with a technical, I can't see what you see, but I hope you are seeing the same. It's just that I'm going to talk very fast about many things, but I would like to stress that the archaeological information we possess and what I will be alluding to is very extensive. In an area that is about 150 kilometers long and 60 to 70 kilometers wide, we have hundreds of excavations. So when I'm talking about patterns, I would be very happy later to expand and explain in details, but at least the archaeological information is extremely detailed. By the way, this is why, it's called the Holy Land. It's full of holes. So, during most of the Late Bronze Age, Canaan was under Egyptian control. The empire, however, focused its attention on the lower, densely settled and economically and strategically important regions, whereas the sparsely settled highlands were given less attention. While Egypt's rule was mostly indirect, that is, via local clients, in the 13th century, the time of 19th dynasty, Egypt strengthened its grip over the region and moved to a more direct form of control. The highlands, however, appear to have been excluded from the Egyptian stronghold, which focused on the lowlands, and experienced, the highlands, a new wave of settlement, with hundreds of small villages gradually filling the region that was sparsely settled for a few centuries. The process, initiated in the 13th century, had received a great deal of scholarly attention within the framework of the debate over the Israelite settlement. Following the extensive surveys of the 1980s, however, it was noticed that the highlands were characterized by severe settlement fluctuations, with previous smaller settlement peaks in the early and middle Bronze Ages. Thank you. The Iron I settlement was therefore viewed as just one stage in a cyclic process of settlement growth and decline. Still, the Iron I settlement wave was not just larger than previous waves, but was also qualitatively different. While in earlier epochs island settlement was but an extension of that of the lowland, that of the Iron I seems to have created a different society, resulting with the formation of highland states and with the transformation of this marginal area into the core of future development. In this paper, I would like to suggest that the deep involvement of a real empire in the local affair of Canaan, or to an extent to the first time in history, led to an unprecedented change in its history, including the breakup of the traditional long-term structure of the country, an event that changed structures, if to use analytic terms, the breakup of existing social formations and the creation of new identities, ethnogenesis, as is common on the fringes of strong imperial control. And it made the rejection of the imperial control and its associated symbolism one of the defining features of the new Highland society, greatly stressing a probably already existing negative view of hierarchy in what Scott, and I thank Ellen for already bringing Scott, what he called state-repelling strategy. There were always differences between highlands of lowlands in Canaan. The valleys and the plains have better soil, are much better suited for agriculture, host the major roads, and were therefore far more important from an economic and military perspective. While such differences often lead to the creation of different societies, this usually did not happen in Bronze Age Canaan, mainly because the highlands are quite tiny. In Cisjordan, the central highlands are only 120 kilometers long and 30 to 40 kilometers wide, and are located in close proximity to the lowlands. Thus, while the potential for a difference existed, in practice, settlement in the highlands was part of a larger local society, part of a wider spectrum. It is most likely that the highland housed more fringe groups, semi-nomads like the Shastu or parasocial groups like the Apiru, but those were present also in the lowlands, whereas the highlands always hosted also sedentary groups. Moreover, the frontier itself shifted, and in many cases was located in the lowland, between the towns and around them. I will elaborate on this in a minute, but should first stress that the failure to identify different societies in the highland during the Bronze Age was not for the lack of wanting. Archaeologists have always attempted to identify cultures, but none were found. Moreover, since according to the biblical chronology, the Israelites were supposed to have settled in the region by the end of the 15th century, many scholars expected to identify a different entity in the highlands. It is the lack of such evidence that led early scholarship to date the Israelite settlement to around 1200. There was simply nothing suitable found. Evidence for a different highland culture first emerged in the Iron One. Now, how do we know it? Well, I think the evidence, I'll try to present it, is unequivocal, given the hot debate and high emotions involved in the dispute over the Iron One settlement. I'm afraid I should have to devote a few words within big brackets to what is, in a sense, perhaps the elephant in the room. Identities are subjective, and in Barth's words, self-ascription and ascription by others. Identities are relational and are always against or in relation to someone or something. And Erickson noted, it is through contact with other that we discover who we are. Identities are changing, and this is of utmost importance. It is oft-quoted, but I think it's sometimes misunderstood, so I'll elaborate about in a minute. Now, every individual has many identities, including personal, gender, family or kinship, professional, local, regional, tribal, totemic, ethnic, and today national identities. And again, the terms are ethic, we call them ethnic, maybe other people would use different terms, but all people have many identities, including many of those that I mentioned. Many of those are held contemporaneously. Tribal or totemic identities differ from ethnic ones, and here again, it's an ethic term. I follow Komarov in this. You can call it Joe and Jim, but those are forms of group identity, both, whereas totemic one is more prevalent, it's lower intensity, it's more prevalent in small, simple, less hierarchical societies, whereas what we call ethnic identity is a more intense form of identity that exists in complex hierarchical society with asymmetrical relations, usually within the orbit of what we call a state. Often, the emergence of an ethnic identity does not eliminate simpler identities, which are only relegated to a secondary importance, and in different contexts, they might become more important than the ethnic identity. When talking about shifting identity, that is part of how it works. People manipulate identities according to the circumstances, highlighting some at the expense of others. This is what enables a player to blur or to stress differences when it suits them. It must be emphasized, however, that people's own identities are clear to them, not blur, and that in most cases, the changes are not arbitrary and unpredictable. Much of the flux anthropologists refer to is between existing identities and not a frequent and unmitigated adoption of completely new identities. While people do sometimes change their identity and become members of a completely different group, this is rarer than the above, and they will usually not adopt a contrasting identity. Most changes require a preliminary manipulation of existing identities, downplaying problematic ones, and stressing simpler forms of identity, which would enable a subsequent change. Boundary maintenance varies in time and space. That is, a group can maintain a sharp boundary in one period, but not in another, and even in one context, but not in a different contemporaneous one. The main condition leading to the accentuation of an ethnic identity over totemic identities are stress, hostility, competition between asymmetrical groups. States often directly attribute identities to fringe groups. They want to name them, but not always paying attention to indigenous subtleties. and often choosing derogatory terms, which surprisingly are in many cases adopted by the group to which it is applied. When the polity involved in the interaction is very powerful and its actions lead to much movement and transformation, it is often the case that many new identities will be created, what is often called ethnogenesis. Thus, while identities are often in flux, there is some logic that governs the shift, and as Scott noted, much of the flux and apparent disorder is resolved once we examine Hill social order. He studied the Hill country, Hill social order, and reformulations of identity as strategic repositioning. Given the subjective, relational, and changing nature of identities, they clearly do not equal a set of material cultural traits or an archaeological culture. The latter is influenced by many additional factors such as ecology, economy, gender, social status, and I don't have enough time to list everything that influence the archaeological culture or assemblage. Still, all identities have material manifestations, which can be expressed as signs, specific material trait chosen by groups to transmit messages about membership and which help in maintaining the boundaries, or by behavioral patterns that characterize a group, like food habits. There are many others, of course. Thus, while contact between groups will inevitably lead to similarity in many cultural traits and physical items, it usually will also lead to the creation of boundaries in other traits selected to transmit a difference. Not always, but in many cases that would be the end result. The difficulty lies in identifying the traits that the ancients used to transmit messages about their group identity, as opposed to traits that were used to convey messages about social status, occupation, gender, or might result from the setting, politics, or economy. Additionally, the use of the traits vary from one boundary to the others and over time. While the multiplicity of options might suggest that the interpretation of material cultural patterning are endless, this is not always the case. Sometimes no patterns can be identified. For example, when some communities consume a certain type of food while others do not, but no clear boundaries or clustering can be identified. Whatever is the reason, there's little we can do with the data. In other cases, however, there are clear patterns which can be divided very simplistically, and of course I simplify in everything that I said in the last few minutes, can be divided into two types. Gradual patterns in time and space include, for example, a case in which a certain type of pot is produced in one place and its popularity decreases with distance from the production center. And the same applies to changes over time, the famous battleship curves. This is, of course, expected, and the pattern is quite straightforward and can be easily explained. Similarly, consider the case in which a new population arrives at an area, bringing with it a new type of food, but 100 years later, we find that it decreased dramatically. We would simply assume that the new group gradually fitted into the new physical and cultural environment and decreased its foreign features. While not inevitable, this pattern can be easily explained, but it can be explained only if we know that there is a new group coming. Consider the very same graph, I can't point it out, but you see it, the very same graph, in a case when we don't know that there were immigrants. This pattern, when something appears suddenly in large quantities out of the blue, would be very strange, and that leads me to the last type of pattern, when we have sharp boundaries. For example, when a certain type of food or port is extremely dominant in some settlement, but is completely missing from nearby contemporaneous sites that are located within the same ecological niches. And what you see here is an example from the Iron Age, when in a small area, pork was consumed more than 8, usually more than 10%, whereas all neighboring sites avoided it completely. By the way, that's true only for the Iron 1. If you go to the late Bronze Age, you have a very different pattern, and when you move to the Iron 2, it changes gradually again. So obviously, whatever the explanation is, that begs an explanation. The same applies to changes over time, just like I mentioned, when one type And such differences can even be found within the same settlements between neighborhoods and households. And again, what you see here is a small site near in Tel Aviv today, when in one stratum, two different areas revealed completely different assemblages. And you can see, again, some of the information. There are other differences. Again, I have to simplify. And of course, such differences can happen over time when a particular type of house appears en masse in one stratum. It didn't exist before, and it disappeared in the second stratum. Something happened. We have to ask ourselves, what? And when we don't have any simple economic, ecological explanations, obviously we have to look for the answer along cultural lines. Clearly, sharp patterns help us to identify boundaries that were meaningful to the ancients. But can we identify which type of boundary was involved? Often the answer is yes, not always, since different identities have different type of patterning. Take, for example, looms. Assuming that the common view that associates them with women is correct in the ancient Near East, should we find looms in every household but not in public buildings, we could easily account for the pattern. And the distribution of very expensive items would be different, again, found mostly in very rich houses, identified as such on the basis of architecture. Thus, the patterns that result from most identities will be different from one that result from group identities like ethnicity. Now, notably, identifying clear material boundaries in specific traits indicate what was important for a certain society at a certain time and place, and what members of this society actively used to demarcate its social and ethnic boundaries, providing an emic perspective on what members of this society felt was important. What if the pattern we find was a result of actions of those people, those individuals and communities. Closing the brackets and going back to our case study, as already noted, no major boundaries were identified between the Highlands and the Lowlands during the Bronze Age. There were many regional variations, including between those regions, but these were gradual, regional differences which were relevant for some traits only and did not create sharp boundaries. Just like the political map of the period, the cultural one also reveals a mosaic, and there were apparently no clear boundaries in terms of lifestyle between the regions, and both sedentary and fringe group existed in all sub-regions. A comparison with the Iron Age will exemplify the difference. In the late Bronze Age, all types of pottery are found in all regions, including various forms of imported pottery. This is just one type. This all changes in the Iron Age, when imports are practically absent from many sites and regions. Similarly, hundreds of late Bronze Age burials are known from all parts of the country. Where there are differences between Highlands and Lowlands attributed to Egyptian influences, geographical boundaries were blurred. In the Iron Age, however, burials in the Highlands disappear almost completely. For 400 years, nobody died. Well, or they buried in simple inhumations. But the point is that they stopped using burial caves. Even natural caves are not being used for about 400 years. Something happened. Those new practices accompany the almost complete lack of decoration on pottery, a very limited ceramic assemblage, use of new style of houses, and more. This distribution is not a result of gender, profession, ecology, social class, etc. It also has nothing to do with any inherent feature of Highland life, as the above late Bronze Age evidence demonstrate, with dozens of burial caves and many imports. Nor does it have anything to do with poorness, in contrast to some very recent suggestions, because very poor societies sometimes decorate pottery and often bury in elaborate burials, and they can clearly use natural caves. Moreover, most of the above traditions continue into the Iron II, and that's a period of where we have monarchies, states, and nobody would suggest that society was so poor that they couldn't decorate pottery. And I will exemplify it with one house that I excavated in Tel Eitun. The house is about 230 square meter. You have how much it is in feet. On the ground floor only, with ashlar stones and cedars, and the find include bullae, seal, ceilings, and high-quality food, large amount of surpluses. Still, not a single of the 200 complete vessels unearthed was decorated or important. Clearly, the inhabitants were not so poor that they couldn't decorate the pottery. So if to summarize this part, it is only in the Iron Age that we find, for the first time, sharp boundaries between highlands and lowlands. Why did the 13th century settlement wave lead to such a drastic change? Well, I think the answer is that for the first time in the history, there was a real empire that was involved in the local politics concerning the highland. Mobility, both in terms of geography, that is the ability to move around freely, and of identity, that is the ability to change who we are and how we define ourselves or present ourselves, is an integral part of the DNA of fringe groups. Both types of mobility give them flexibility and make it difficult to control them. States, therefore, have a built-in distaste towards such groups and an interest to fix them, again, both in space and in terms of identity. We know of many such fringe groups in late Bronze Age Canaan belonging to two broad categories, the Apiru, various social outcasts, and the Shasu, which are described as semi-nomad. But it is clear that those terms are very rough and they represent a sedentary perspective or imperial perspective of those groups, which had many, many variations among them. And this is also indicated by the text, by the way, those variations. The empire had an interest to define this group and fix them so they could be controlled. Mainly, for example, Bunimovich and Morris noted that when strengthening its all over the lowland, the empire pushed and bullied these groups, coercing them to cooperate and perhaps settle or become mercenaries and the like. It is likely that this pushed many of them away to areas that were from the area that were strongly monitored to the more free highlands, which the empire did not control at that time. Until these times, there was a wide spectrum of identities, including the different sedentary communities in both the lowlands and the highland, which obviously differentiated among themselves, as well as various semi-sedentary and parasocial groups that were active in all regions. The closing of the lowland frontier pushed some of these groups into the highlands, whether forcing them to migrate or making them leave due to taxes and conscription, and they probably were joined by other groups. Such an historical context, with strong empire bullying small fringe groups, is exactly the context in which new groups are created, or what is often called ethnogenesis. Given this context, a number of things are likely to happen. As I said, migrations of fringe groups into the highlands, reducing the percentage of sedentary population there. The shared experience among the marginalized highlanders led to growing feeling of we-ness among them. Given that the other is the most important feature in defining the we, the highland groups developed a shared sentiment on top of their existing identity. As Erickson noted, and just as an example, he studied Mauritius, and he noted that until the influx of tourists, the local group had no notion of being Mauritians. There was no notion of any shared identity. Only once there was an influx of tourists, suddenly being a Mauritian became something. It was like popping up at a certain context. The highland sedentary population, while maintaining its unique identity, gradually became part of the larger highland group. In any interaction between the highland and lowland peoples, the broad highland identity became more pronounced than the local one. It's like in daily life you can fight with in the other neighborhoods about who's going to win in football, but suddenly when there's a bigger match with against someone more important, the local differences are reduced. It's not so important because we're dealing with someone else. So when circumstances change, when people in the highland dealt with people from represented the empire or the lowland, then suddenly the we-ness, the new identity, was more important than the local identities which existed. This context also explains the importance of ethnic traits that were chosen in this period. Many fringe and frontier societies throughout the world have strong egalitarian ideas. This is part of both their ethos and, to some extent, their way of life, and is not something exceptional. While many scholars identified such an ethos in ancient Israel, on the basis of both textual and material evidence, the first to associate it with a large-scale sociological phenomenon was the leading comparative sociologist Gerhard Lansky. According to Lansky, the interesting thing about frontier societies is that all of them exhibit an antagonism toward traditional centers of power and toward the institutional arrangement that supported those centers. Populist and democratic ideologies developed and often acquired a quasi-religious status. Despite the shortcomings of Lansky's work, the similarities with the Iron One Island are, in my view, real. Still, it appears that Lansky's observation should be viewed within a slightly different framework, that of the Highland. Inherent dichotomy between highlands and lowland societies was noted by many. Brodel, for example, noted that the mountains are, as a rule, a world apart from civilizations which are an urban and lowland achievement. Their history is to remain always on the fringes of the great waves of civilizations, which may spread over great distances in the horizontal plane, but are powerless to move vertically. And Baron de Thot stated that the steepest places have always been the asylum of liberty. The issue was developed recently by James Scott, who claimed that the hills, however, are not simply a space of political resistance, but also a zone of cultural refusal. The hill population do not generally resemble the valley centers culturally, religiously, or linguistically. The highlands were always a place of refuge and state evasion, where democratic ideologies prospered in the face of hierarchical lowland peoples and empires. As noted by Scott, the overriding goals of the uplanders is to avoid being ordered about. And again, it repeats themes that were mentioned by Ellen and I think others. But as I noted, the highlands of Canaan are too small to serve in such a capacity. They are only relatively high and are not remote. While some fault line always existed, during the Bronze Age there wasn't really a break. Still, democratic ideas and resentment of authority commonly existed in the fringes. As frontier shifted, so did the concept that accompanied the frontier. The egalitarian ideology continued to circulate in social fringes even when not physically in the highlands. These egalitarian ideologies were therefore not invented in the 13th century, but simply adopted and imbued with new meaning because the historical context was such that they were of extreme use. The Highlanders had to demarcate the boundaries between themselves and their other. For this, they chose things that they already had, and that could easily highlight their difference with the empire and its lowland collaborators. These traits or behaviors, therefore, even if originally used by only some of the settlers, became traits of the larger new we group. The egalitarian ethos is one such feature. It was common in Fringe societies and was ideally suited to demarcate the boundaries between the holders of the new Highland identity and the lowlands others, and was therefore chosen to differentiate between us and them. It is a deep involvement of an empire that made the Highland-lowland continuum break along the existing fault line. In summary, the highlands of Bronze Age Canaan were small and served as a hinterland of the lowland without sharp break between them. The 13th century settlement wave changed these long-term structures, initially creating a sharp break between the new Highland society and the lowland groups, and eventually turning the highlands into a core. In Brodelian terms, this was an event that changed long-term structures, longue durée. The critical factor was a deep involvement for the first time in history of an empire in Canaan's local affairs, especially relating to the highland, forcing fringe groups into the highland where they formed a counter-society encompassing the original identities within the new one that was developed to contrast the empire and its collaborator. Thank you for your attention.